besides Peter Schiff, who do you think are the real critics out there being vocal about Bitcoin at this point?
Well, the whole hard money crowd has been strangely out there in opposition to Bitcoin. And it's funny to say, in opposition to, because, of course, it doesn't matter how much you like it or don't like it. Bitcoin's going to do whatever it wants to do. So it's a little strange. The other thing that's a little odd about the hard money crowd is they keep comparing Bitcoin to gold. And I don't know what relevance that has at all. Gold is just gold. It's not money. It's just gold. It hasn't been anything like money on the international level for some 40 years. And it's been 80 years since you could convert any dollars into gold at the domestic level. In other words, this is all basically ancient history. I mean, we're talking about lifetimes ago. And there's absolutely no chance that, unless you're just completely full of political fantasy, that governments of the world are going to somehow see to it to change their currencies from fiat back into gold in order to establish sound money. I mean, that's not going to happen. So why does everybody keep comparing it to gold? Well, not only that, but it's a terrible comparison. I mean, gold is just not portable in the same way that cryptocurrency is. It's just not the thing for the internet age.
One of the big problems that comes up over and over again is always this assumption that the price, even if the price is really high right now, if you actually tried to sell a bunch at this price, well, that'd be a completely different matter. And of course, the implied assumption there is that in order to capture the value and spend, the earnings that you have accumulated through speculating on Bitcoin, you have to convert it into some other type of currency in order to spend it. And I mean, I think that that's really the fundamental problem that I see more often than not, is people just not appreciating that. It's like saying to someone, I'll pay you in a second, I have to go sell my cash real quick. The nomenclature just doesn't work.
Yeah, you mean that the problem with Bitcoin is in order to realize your gains, you have to leave that ecosphere and enter into a government fiat currency?
I think that's one of the common assumptions from people who don't actually do trade with Bitcoin. I don't know about you. I mean, I don't actually know how you use Bitcoin at all, besides the very basics. I very, very rarely convert into dollars when I'm going to spend Bitcoin. Most of the time, I'm spending Bitcoin as Bitcoin. And sometimes it's through a service that does conversion themselves. But as a consumer, I don't care about that. I just care that I'm able to capture the high value that I think I should be getting for it.
Well, and I'll tell you another objection I've heard recently. It was in an audience I was speaking the other day. I think it was in Austin, Texas, and then I read it again online somewhere. People say that the value of Bitcoin is entirely supported by its convertibility to the dollar, and if it weren't for that, then Bitcoin would not have any value at all. To me, this is looking at everything completely upside down. The point is the value of Bitcoin comes from its convertibility into any goods and services, and one of those goods is government paper money. So it's not somehow that it's dependent on the conversion into dollars as such. And people quickly retort, oh, no, if you're going to acquire Bitcoin, you have to buy them with dollars. Actually, that's not true. You can acquire Bitcoin with services that you render or some of the goods that you sell. You can sell anything for Bitcoin or perform any service for Bitcoin. You can bypass the dollar economy entirely and live within Bitcoin ecosphere, coming and going, really. So this completely misses the point. I think a lot of the problems and the misunderstandings here, conceptual difficulties people have here, is that they don't understand what it means for something to be an open source protocol living on a distributed network. That's too big an abstraction. People tend to think of Bitcoin as being a product being offered by a company in the same way that a gold mining company might offer stocks or something like that, or like a stock to Amazon or something. They don't have a conception of Bitcoin as being an open source protocol that more or less belongs to everybody, that lives on distributed networks. That is, it's not a proprietary company. It's not an investment scheme. It's just it's a tool that takes advantage of cryptography and peer-to-peer networks and distributed networks and open source development models of software to achieve a kind of an ideal monetary situation, ideal for now anyway. That's just really difficult for people to, if you haven't been keeping up for the last 20 years and the changes and the way the world works and the way software works, then you're just going to have a hard time understanding that. The other thing I've noticed about Bitcoin is that it's very difficult. One of the things you'll find with all the opponents, the people that are speaking out against it all the time, it's difficult for them to admit what they don't know. I tweeted out yesterday, show me a person who is opposed to Bitcoin, and you'll see a person who believes that he or she knows everything there is to know about it. But in fact, if you find a real expert on Bitcoin, you hear a real curiosity and a willingness to learn and watch the markets and follow the markets and be a little bit humble in the face of these amazing developments. So there's some principle that governs this, but the expertise, like ultimate final expertise in Bitcoin, seems to be limited to those people who are dogmatically opposed to it just because they think they know things they don't know. Let me just bring up, too, a fascinating, persistent complaint that keeps going on Just because I was interviewed about this from Wired magazine the other day, for some reason, Wired seems to have some editorial doubts about Bitcoin. I guess they've been expressed in a number of articles. And they think that they seized on one the other day, and they noticed that it was deflationary. You brought this up at the beginning of this talk, it's deflationary. And you can't have a money supply system that's deflationary. This is the ultimate nightmare in a way. And it's funny because, I address this on two levels. One is that the reason people are opposed to a deflationary monetary system is they think that that's a sort of a velocity killer, that as something is growing in value, people hold on to it, and that's not what you're supposed to do with money. You're supposed to spend money, not supposed to just hoard it, and that hoarding will cause liquidity traps, for example, in old-fashioned Keynesian terms. So the first level of critique of that is to just observe empirically that, yes, theoretically, it would seem that people would be holding on to coins more if they're growing in value, just because if you spend them now, you're sort of giving up profits you could realize later. The thing that you notice from talking to any of the companies that specialize in providing widgets online for spending Bitcoins is that they boom in value when the price in terms of dollars is going up. In other words, when Bitcoin is becoming more valuable, they see the pace of spending dramatically increase, not decrease. So we're actually seeing empirically the reverse of what theory would predict. So that's just a fact, and I'm just laying it out there. And I just explained it just because, as I told the guy at Wired, the purpose of currency isn't just to hoard it forever. That's just kind of dumb. The whole purpose of currency is precisely to spend it. And then people need stuff and they want stuff, and so they spend it. And it's as simple as that. The pace of which it's spent could go up and down depending on conditions. But essentially, you just think of it intuitively. A person's, bought Bitcoin at $8 and it's suddenly $800. They're like, I'm going to use this stuff now.
Right.
So there's that. And the second thing to observe about this whole deflationary fear is that it's fundamentally based on nothing whatsoever. It's one of those kinds of fears that result from macroeconomic textbooks in which monetary economists lay out what they consider to be the ideal monetary system, but It's not actually based on any kind of fact. There are sectors of economic life that have been living in a state of deflation for 20 or 30 years. The most obvious example is computers and software have been falling in price for a very long time. Or another way to put it is that the value of the dollar has grown in terms of software for 30 years now. And even some sectors of the clothing industry is the same way, and other things. Then it hasn't actually harmed business. It hasn't led to liquidity traps and disasters for company profitability. And if you go back further in time, you can look at the late 19th century when we actually did go on a government gold standard following the Civil War. We saw a continuous appreciation of the money in terms of goods and services all the way up until essentially until World War I. And it was also happened to be the highest growth period ever in American history. We were seeing 8, 9, 10% per annum economic growth. So there's really no evidence that somehow a currency that's rising in value is somehow harmful for economic growth. I think it's just a fallacy. We're not used to it. We're not used to the fact that we can get money, hold it, and then convert it later and get more for our money than we had before. We've lived through a century of inflation, so we just don't think that's supposed to happen somehow. But it probably in a free market, it is supposed to happen. My final point on this is that, look, Satoshi Nakamoto came up with this protocol. He threw it out there. If somebody doesn't like the fact that it's a deflationary currency, then switch to something else. If you don't like it, don't use it. But ultimately, there's got to be some relationship between what people desire in a microeconomic sense and what's desirable in a macroeconomic sense.
The differentiating between the micro and the macro, I think that is 100% the disconnect on this particular issue. I've been thinking about this a lot because you're right. It's a huge issue, and people don't understand. They just assume that this hoarding thing is going to happen. From my experience personally, not just with regards to Bitcoin, but just broadly speaking, I've had a variety of incomes over my life. And the times when I've spent a lot of money are times when I felt like I was really comfortable and like I could comfortably spend a lot of money without endangering, my lifestyle at that current point. And the times when I haven't spent a lot of money is when I don't have any money to spend and I don't feel like it's a responsible decision for me to do that. So with Bitcoin, it's like, the more the price goes up, the more I feel like I have the ability to spend it because I get to spend less. That's been true for a lot of people that I know. And I know that there certainly are some people who have their Bitcoins on a flash drive stuck in a safety deposit box in 3 different banks all over the country, and they never plan to touch it for 10 years. But I don't think that that's the majority of people because it doesn't make sense.
I think you're right to sort of rely on these intuitions. One of the things you notice about this form of economics that's been conventionally taught at the academic level since about conventionally since about the 1940s, is that there's this great disconnect between what's good for the individual and what's good for society. So, we're always hearing about liquidity traps, for example, or the paradox of savings, so-called.
A liquidity trap in the context of the Keynesian argument that you're talking about here would be where everybody holds on to their dollars and saves them, and because of that, there are very few dollars going around through the economy, and so there isn't enough liquidity, and so loans are required, but they're hard to get because nobody wants to lend, right?
Right. So the idea is that you might think it's good for you to hold money, but actually it's bad for you because the economy as a whole needs money sort of circulating around in order to kickstart it, get things to provide the grease. There's all these weird metaphors that people use, about grease and machines and all this stuff.
Right.
And then this speaks to the so-called paradox of saving, that you might think it's a good thing to save money. Actually, it's a terrible thing to save money, according to the Keynesian view. And you hear presidents talk about this all the time. Like I remember after 9/11, George Bush was going around saying, we can defeat terrorism by going out and buying something. Right. Well, a lot of people had I think a very justified sense that maybe going into debt and squandering a bunch of money at a time of great uncertainty is probably not a good idea. So the paradox of savings tries to tell people to do things that are against their own self-interest. So I think that, anytime you hear an economic theory that seems to drive a wedge between what's good for you and what's good for everybody else, you're good for society, that should be the first tip-off that there's something funny going on here. And so a lot of the fear of deflation really comes down to that. The Chicago Fed paper, also, we should say something about that came out, about 3-4 weeks ago. It was a big blast against Bitcoin. And I wrote an article about it because I thought it was just hilarious. They were saying that Bitcoin was a sort of a secretive, confused, highly complex currency that was controlled by a handful of developers operating in secret. And, as I read that sentence, I thought, my God, that sounds like a perfect description of the Federal Reserve, actually.
That does seem to be more and more true, is, whatever they're saying, probably they're the ones doing it.
It seemed like a massive sort of act of Freudian projection of some sort. I mean, that entire paper was very strange.
So while we're on the subject of central banks, the Central Bank of China, one of the governors of that, recently released a kind of cautiously optimistic statement about Bitcoin. And again, it seems like this movement up in price has been largely driven by the seeming okayness of the Chinese Communist Party with their people converting yuan into Bitcoin. That seems like it's a real dangerous place if that's what the price of Bitcoin is relying on right now.
Yeah, if that's true, I don't know to what extent that's empirically verified.
Well, BTC China has seen prices converted to U.S. dollars. They only trade yuan and Bitcoin, but converted to U.S. dollars, they've seen prices over $1,100. So most of the market right now, most of the exchanges that are seeing their price spike up are happening through arbitrage trades that are going essentially from the U.S. exchanges that have the lower price, but that you can't purchase in yuan, and then being arbitraged over to the BTC China, where they can achieve a 25% increase.
I gather that China has some pretty severe exchange controls, and Bitcoin is just to escape from that, right? At least that's what people tell me.
Right. I mean, that's been my impression as well. It's hard to get good information out of China, it seems like. But again, the number of people who could give you good information about what the government is going to do. But it seems like in the U.S., there's been a harder line stance where the impression has been that something, they would do something about it, but maybe they actually won't do something about it. But in China, the impression has been they're okay with it because these things have made their way onto state television, and there have been a variety of documentaries essentially encouraging people to look at this currency. And I mean, again, I don't think it's possible to enforce currency controls once you've stepped away from controllable currency like the yuan and moved into something like Bitcoin.
Well, you got to figure, too, that, China's the ultimate situation where we have vast amount of crufty laws. There's tons of things on the books that exist that are not really well enforced, that party officials themselves regret, but they have no power to change them. One of the things we haven't really talked about is that government is a kind of a big industry all over the world, and government officials themselves, I would like to imagine that they're all squeaky clean and wonderful and not accepting bribes and doing graft and stuff like that. But the fact is that the real business of government is, has an underground economy just as much as anywhere else does. So government officials need a way to accumulate wealth outside the purview of their colleagues, and they need a way to receive bribes just to make things work right. So, in the past, you could rely to some extent on Swiss banking and that sort of thing, but, that's less and less viable now. So I'm very interested in this idea that maybe governments around the world, individual members of cabinets, of staffs, of old-line bureaucracies will discover Bitcoin as a viable way to do business for themselves and be less likely to crack down on the private sector just because they see so many personal advantages to it. Otherwise, it's really difficult to explain how it is that China just had this laissez-faire attitude, unless that laissez-faire attitude has just become pervasive within the policy culture of the Chinese government. I just don't know.
Or it's worth poking the U.S. dollar in the eye more than they care about preserving their own capital controls for the minority of people who are going to take advantage of this. I don't really know what the answer is, but that definitely seems like it's one of the important questions that's going to have to develop over 2014. Jeffrey, our time always goes by too fast. I look forward to continuing this conversation. Before we end it, are there any projects that you're working on right now that are new that you want to talk about, or anything that you want to promote?
Well, I mean, I'm working almost full-time now on developing this digital city called Liberty Me. It's the idea is to create an ultimate global communication network for liberty-minded people to talk about things like cryptocurrency and get good solid information through information sharing. There's no platform like that out there right now, so I'm working on, I've got the best developers I know and the best technicians I know, and using every tool that I've got and trying to put together this massive platform for this purpose, which will be a publishing platform and social network, and will also be, of course, accepting Bitcoin at it. So it's going to be very edgy and very advanced. We're talking about something like a February 15th release, and so we hope that goes well and we dazzle the world with the thing.
Jeffrey Tucker, liberty.me. Thank you very much for your time.
That's right.
Happy holidays from Let's Talk Bitcoin. If you like the work we're doing, we appreciate Bitcoin tips of all sizes at letstalkbitcoin.com. Just as importantly, share the show with your peers and review the show on iTunes. Don't be kind, be honest. LTB reaches nearly 10,000 listeners, but has less than 50 reviews anywhere I can find. I'd very much appreciate your help in remedying this situation. Thanks for listening.